We're going to take a look at how to build some landscapes in a program called World Creator. For Windows and Mac, it's $149 for the standard edition, or for the professional, it's $280 or $250. And you can see all the differences on this page here. But we'll just take a quick look at what's possible in this program. Here's some examples made with World Creator. And a lot of these are rendered outside of World Creator, but the terrain was generated inside of it. And on this gallery page, I actually have a couple pieces that I've done. Here's one that I'm quite proud of. So with that, let's hop into World Creator. It starts you with a big kind of rough base to start with. And over here, you can see there's terrain width and length. So this is the size of the terrain in meters. And then right below this, the precision is kind of the resolution of this. So we want to make a somewhat small landscape, so we'll go to 512 and zoom into that. And navigation in World Creator is a little weird. It's almost more like a video game engine than a 3D creation program, because middle clicking and dragging will pan around. But then if I right click and drag, it looks around. And then W, A, S, and D will kind of slowly fly you around. So with the mouse and those keys, you can kind of awkwardly pan and pivot around. So if it looks like I don't know what I'm doing, it's just because these controls are a little bit funky. So we have our small terrain here. Let's turn up the resolution to 1K by 1K, because that way whatever we're working with in here, we'll be able to replicate and spark pretty well. So we'll change this precision from 1 meter to a ½ meter, which increases that resolution here. You probably noticed there's a little bit more detail in this now. If we turn this up even higher to 1/8 and zoom in, you can see it's still really sharp even up close. But if we go back to 1/2, it's a little bit softer, a little bit lower res. And by default, it has this noise applied under this fractal noise properties. You can drag this down to totally flatten that out. But it's okay to start with a little bit of noise because we're going to be adding filters on top of this. And if you want to reset anything, you can click this little back arrow and just click yes to reset this section here to its default values. And if you don't like how this is kind of randomly made, up here under seed, you can click the R to randomize it. You might have to zoom out to see it. And this doesn't matter too much because we're going to be adding plenty more to it. So let's hop over to the Filters tab and add a layer. And World Creator has a lot of functionality where you can add multiple layers and add areas to each layers that are affected. But in our case, we're just going to add a few filters. So in this filters here, we'll click Add. So for this first filter, we're going to go to Effect and make a crater. And automatically, you can see a few craters created here, but we're just going to make a single one. And it disappears because this is 512 by 512 and the offset is set to 1K by 1K. So I think we want this to be 256 and 256. That way it's centered in this 512 grid. Under crater scale, we want to crank this up just so it fills a good chunk of this tile. And then edge height, we want to crank this up just to kind of lift that up more. So now we have an overall crater shape built. Now before we click out of this, we need to click Add, or else this filter won't be applied. So just click Add there. And you can see it doubled in height here because now we're looking at a second filter that we'll make. So if we tap around, you can see this crater shape's still there, but all these different effects are taking place. So you have to click Add to confirm these. So next, let's add a little bit more noise to this. So let's go back to General and then click Noise. And then turn the strength way down. And the scale, let's turn down just so we get a few bigger chunks. We're just trying to get a little bit more variation in these flat pieces out here. So when that looks good, click Add. And now we'll go over to Dunes and add some wavy dunes. Now you can see it took away a lot of our crater shape. So let's just click add here and then click back. And if we select this crater, we can adjust these parameters and see how it affects everything that's forward in the stack as well. So for the edge height, we can try cranking this up higher. That way we get a more defined shape here. And if these small little sandy lines are too intense in the wavy dunes, we can scroll down under the filter level strengths. And this controls how much intensity this filter has on the different steps of detail. So step 1 is kind of the broad strokes. You can see it has major effects on these top few. And then these bottom filters are for the small details. So you see changes in the ridges when we adjust these. So if we turn these bottom ones down a little bit, you can see these smaller ridges are a lot more subtle. But then we do lose a little bit of that sharpness. So sometimes you just kind of have to slide things around and get a good balance. I think these bottom two are the main ones that add a lot of those small details. You can also change the density up here, and that will adjust those little ridges as well. Now to add some more realism, let's add some wind erosion to this. So under filters, I'll click add. Then under basic erosion, we'll select wind. And the beauty of World Creator is it's all GPU based, so you can quickly just preview all these different effects and see what looks nice. But in our case, let's go to wind and turn up this length just so there's a good amount of wind erosion happening. You can also change direction by shifting this around. And right now you can see it totally gets rid of all of our detail, but we're going to change that in a second. So let's add and close. Then with wind still selected, we'll scroll down and use angle select. This means the wind filter will only be applied to areas that have a specific angle. So by default, it looks kind of chunky, but we'll adjust these amounts. If we turn up the angle width and the smoothness, and then adjust this angle, it can be a little finicky based on your values, but you can kind of find a sweet spot where the angle matches up really nicely. Then you start getting these nice natural ridges that kind of add on to the overall dunes already in place. And if you do want to see what it looks like super high res, you can go back to the base and change this precision at any time. So right now we're just at 1K by 1K, but if we increase it to 1/8 meter, all these details get a lot sharper. We could even try going a little bit farther. It's 8K by 8K. Now all these little details are really sharp. But of course we can't have this high of resolution in Spark, so I'm going to keep it at 1/2. So we're at 1K by 1K. And because we do want the edges of this to be pretty flat when we bring it into Spark, let's go over to filters and add one more filter. And this will be under general, and it's called border blend. Now by default, the edges look a little sharp. It looks like it's blending too aggressively and there's not enough fall off. So under the border blend range, it looks like it's just going from 0.99 to 1, which is probably why it's just on that very, very edge there. If we take this left handle here and drag it in a bit, looks like it takes a second to refresh. You can see it's blending this height information to be completely flat on the edges. And we don't need to be very aggressive. We just want the very outside to be totally flat. And by dragging this general strength, you can see the effect of this. And it actually changes the overall contour of it a fair amount as you adjust this up. So we'll click add. And then back to see all of our filters. So really quickly, we made a crater shape, added a little bit of extra noise, added some dunes to that, and then some wind erosion on top of that. And you can continue to crank this up and down even after everything's in place. See the effects of that. And then finally, border blend to make it all flat on the edges. And once you're happy with your landscape, you can go over to the export section. And we'll be exporting two different things. We want to get the height information first out of an OBJ. So we'll select OBJ. And under resolution, let's turn this down to half right now, because we'll optimize this a little bit more in Cinema 4D. And then just click export. Now we also need to get a normal map off of this. So we'll change this from height map to normal map. And I'm just going to use a JPEG. Then just click export. So to double check these, we'll look at the normal map. And that looks accurate. You can definitely see the contours in there. And then let's check this OBJ. Looks like that's intact, and it looks like the overall shape is correct. So now to optimize this, let's hop over to Cinema 4D. In Cinema, we need to drag in our OBJ. You can see it already looks pretty good even without the normal map, but it's a little chunky and doesn't have a lot of detail. Then on this default material, we can drag in the normal map. Just drag that JPEG directly on this part here. And then we get the normal map applied. And to make sure it's full res, with this selected, we'll go to viewport and change this to 1K. And now you can see the ridges get applied there, just because it wasn't high enough resolution before. And objects with normal maps look a little bit weird without a light, so I'll add a light in the center here. And it looks like the origin of this is a little bit off. So let's just select this, and then center axis 2, and then I'll reset the PSR, just so that's nice and centered. And I'll lift this light up. And I actually want the axis to be not centered, but centered probably on this area here. So what I can do is hit L and then select this very corner point, and that will center that there. And then in mesh, axis, axis center, I think I'll actually go to point mode and select the very outer corners, holding shift to multiple select. So these points should be totally flat. So if I go to center, center axis 2, and then do selected points, and execute that, the center now should be perfectly aligned with this edge. So if I reset the PSR, switch to the front view really quick, these edges are perfectly flush with 0. So it should line up with our ground plane over in Spark. Now to clean up the scene, I'm going to hide a few things. Turn off the work plane, the world axis, and I don't mind the horizon back there, so I'll keep that on. So now we have our nice looking landscape here. But if I hit NB to go to wireframe view, you can see there's a ton of geometry. We definitely can't have this much over in Spark. So with the landscape selected, we'll go up here and make a polygon reduction and hold Alt or Option to make this a child. And it has to process for a second because let's see how big this is. Under mode, you can go to project info and it'll show you how much memory it's taking up and then how many polygons there is. Looks like there's 500,000, so it takes a little bit to reduce that. So now it's set to a reduction strength by default of 90%. So you can see these edges get really flattened out and really simplified because they're actually perfectly flat. And then the higher detailed areas, I'll hit NF just to see the wireframe view. The more detailed areas get a little bit more detail there. And we can actually set our goal triangle count to something closer to, say, 20,000. Let's see how that looks. It's actually still pretty detailed. We can try 10,000. And it's hard to see how big this is going to be without combining these into one object. So I'm just going to do that with the connect objects. Now, again, I can go to mode and project info. So this is 610 kilobytes for this object here. So I think this might be a good size to work with. Now I'll hit NA to switch back to shaded view. And if we take this and disable our reduction and move it over, we can see if there's much of a difference at all between the two. Hitting NB, we can see the resolution of the two. So obviously this one has way, way more than this. Hitting NA to go back to shaded view. I mean, from a distance, they look identical. Up close, you can see it starts to get a little chunky. But overall, especially if we're going to be viewing this from a little bit of a distance, this looks totally fine. And if you are concerned about these little chunks that have been made, you could manually go in and add some polygons, but I'm not going to do that because from a distance, I think this looks really nice. And we're going to add some particle effects to the ridges here. So I think this is good. So I'll rename this to Sand Crater. And I'll rename this material to Matte Sand Crater. And then we can just export this as an FBX. And the key setting here is to have Phong-Lambert set and then make sure the normals are on and we don't have any animation. So now we have the model created and the normal map. So let's open up Spark and see what we can do.